So if I were to say to you, in the words of a great author, one fish, two fish, red fish.
Teacher's like, okay, everybody, all right. Pop quiz time. We're going to do the vocabulary to it. And I just yell out, wait, I got to make my cheat sheet.
I like to joke that I make my living throwing away dead people's sex toys.
I can guarantee you there is nothing you have felt that I haven't felt.
Yeah, and I am a formerly miserable person.
If people don't know how you are, they cannot help you.
Anxiety is the rattling of the lid on the pot of boiling water.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's connected, like me letting go of the past, me not hanging on to my anger, me like trying to become a present being.
You're not in your peak dieting phase now?
I mean, I was only in it for like a quick 6 minutes on a car ride once because I was in between.
Can we stop for snacks?
Yeah, I was equidistant between two fast food places.
So that if I'm in a situation with like my older daughter and she says something hurtful to me, like you're wearing a lot of statement jewelry right now.
In the very, very niche world of American ghost towning, my dad is a minor celebrity.
Well, we have 50% of the country's in dire poverty, is in homelessness. You know, LA is
50% of the country is in homelessness. That seems like not a correct statistic. Hey, this is Sean Conroy, and you're listening to Sean Conroy Gets Happier. Thank you for doing that. When I was in second grade, we had a substitute teacher. Her name was Mrs. Seagal, so we all called her Mrs. Seagull and didn't quite understand the difference. When I was a kid, words that sounded similar were, to me, the same word, which is why the previous year I had attended a wedding in Cape Cod. Mrs. Seagull was noticeably older than all of us and than almost everyone I knew, except my grandparents and old Mr. Higginbottom, who lived in the... Well, it doesn't matter who Mr. Higginbottom was. Mrs. Seagull told us it was story time, and she asked us all to come over and sit on the story time rug crisscross applesauce. She called it something different. It was the 70s. She started reading to us, and as she read, she fell asleep. And we, being second graders, didn't wake her. We just sat there, crisscross applesauce, and waited till she woke up, and then we all pretended it didn't happen. I mention this because I had the same experience recently while I was in therapy. Except that I was the one telling the story, and my therapist was the one sleep. Oh, and my therapist was the one sitting crisscross applesauce on the storytime rug. Now, this is not the only therapist I've been to, and I've had varying degrees of success and failure with them. Overall, I highly recommend it. I think therapy is great, which is why I'm happy to have my guest today on the show. Dr. Suvrat Bhargave is a psychiatrist who seemed to have no problem staying awake for our whole discussion. He had some interesting thoughts on things that people allow to get in the way of their personal happiness. He feels that all it takes is a moment of insight for people to change their self-defeating behaviors. In fact, he feels so strongly about this that that's the name of his book, A Moment of Insight. Now, all the way from the ATL, Atlanta, Georgia, the 13th colony, the Aloha State, here is Dr. Suvrat Bhargave.
We tend to oftentimes not want to be vulnerable, men perhaps especially, but it's viewed sometimes as a weakness, sometimes it is viewed as if I'm vulnerable, I could get hurt. But when a person comes to see a psychiatrist, at that point they're at their most difficult time and they've got nothing to lose, and they have the courage to then come in and, at least within the four walls of my office, tell me what's going on or what they're feeling. And in those ways where they choose to be vulnerable, as it turns out, what was very scary to begin with, leads to some really amazing transformation. So yeah, when I say being vulnerable and raw, it's to honor, thousands of people who've had the courage to do that in my office, and in doing so found that there was value in it. And I have others who come in understandably skeptical or nervous or tense, and so they might hold out. And so, people have their own timeline, and I honor that, and I'm going to just kind of get them through that. But I think once they find out that they're not going to be judged for anything they say in my office, and I think once they see that I'm just going to be myself as well, I'm not going to preach to them or talk down in any way, and wherever possible, maybe even relate to them, I think then it makes it easier for them to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that's always been a fear of mine when I've been in therapy. Not always, but certainly some of the times I've been there, it's like, oh, if I say this thing out loud, this person will judge me. And it turns out that's not the therapist's job.
That's right. And that's the difference. Sometimes people will say, well, do I need to see a therapist? I've got a really good relationship with my friend, or gosh, I can talk to my parents about this. But it's not the same. It's not the same for at least two reasons. Number one, what we just touched on, anyone that you're talking about in that capacity is going to be biased one way or the other about you and with you and all of that. And number two, if you're going to be vulnerable and talk about some, deep issues or some powerful things, they may not know what to do with it. And we are trained to have at least some idea of how to navigate that and help you navigate that. So it's a different experience, but certainly it's rooted in the fact that it's not our place, nor do we want to be judging you for what you're going through. And my personal feeling on that is, I in my book I talk about my own times of doubt and struggle, and I can guarantee you there is nothing you have felt that I haven't felt. And if that's the case, then how could I turn around and judge you? You may not have gone through what I've gone through, and I may not have gone through what you've gone through, but judgment comes from, some feeling of right or wrong, or this team or that camp. And there's nothing you have felt that I haven't felt.
Can you tell me what a moment of insight is, or what you mean by that?
Yeah, for sure. So, when I sit with people, people often come in hoping, for their circumstances to change or something to be different in their lives, or to stop feeling the way they've been feeling. Everyone's kind of coming in looking for some relief, which obviously, that's the whole reason to come on in.
Right.
But oftentimes, people are very discouraged or frustrated, and I've had people ask me often, what will it take? When will I finally get better? What does it need to get better? And I tell people it really just takes this moment, this thing called a moment of insight. And a moment of insight is where you have a way of looking in on a way of thinking or feeling or behaving that you've been doing for a long time, perhaps, that isn't working for you, but now you see it in a different way. So it's a little bit like an aha or a shift that happens, but it's a pause in the way that you see things or understand things. And in that moment, when you see it differently, you can now do something about it. So many people, for example, have the habit of being self-critical and talking down to themselves and, being their own worst critics and all that kind of stuff. But they don't even know it. It becomes a habit, right? But as soon as you have a moment where you realize, gosh, I can't believe I would say that to myself, then now that you've seen it, you have a chance to change it. So it does require a shift. It requires your being able to see something about the way you're thinking, feeling, or behaving in a way that you've never seen it before, and that leads to all kinds of change. So a moment of insight can be subtle, or it can be really, really big, but that's what causes change to happen. And that's why I called it a moment of insight.
Right. So it can be as big as this is where I start referencing historical things. It can be as big as Saul on the road to Damascus, right? Where all of a sudden he realizes that his whole life needs to change. Or it can be much smaller than that. Like I should stop drinking so much coffee.
Yeah, exactly. And whatever it is, insight is your ability to kind of shine a spotlight within, right? And then when you do that, you see something about yourself and you're able to be objective about it. And I think so much of the way we think about ourselves or feel about ourselves is based on the outside, what other people think about us or trying to please other people and all of that. And I think that oftentimes we're not willing to look at it objectively. We're so run by our emotions that we don't look at it objectively. But a moment of insight is the exact opposite of that. It's where you look at it on the inside and you see something, and it's like putting emotion aside for a second and just acknowledging it, that, yeah, I'm doing this and it's really not working for me. So it could be as big as what you said, or it could be as small as what you said, but it can cause change to happen once you see it that way.
Right. And so probably not a good moment of insight is when you realize you're treating yourself a certain way or talking to yourself a certain way, and you go, God, I am really mean to myself. What a jerk I am. That's probably not helpful. So here's my question.
Well, actually, Sean, I would say this. That is really helpful because, again, a moment of insight is about noticing something about yourself, in particular, that isn't working. So the beating yourself up phenomenon, which, boy, everyone listening right now, I'm sure many people can relate to this, but I talk about this in the book from my own experience, having been a person that did that incessantly. I mean, I would talk to myself more about what I was not doing right than I ever did about what I was doing right. And I had done it for so long from childhood on that I didn't even know how much I was doing it. So it was my moment of insight one day when I realized a friend had come up to me and was asking me for some advice. And I would have friends come up to me all the time and ask for advice, even at a young age, even before I had an MD behind my name or could have a couch to have them lay down on and talk to me.
They just knew you were the guy to go to.
Yeah, I mean, I think people sense, who is someone that they can be vulnerable with and who therefore may have something to share. And so people would come up to me. And so I had this friend who had just, we had this really great interaction, and he'd confided things to me and how he's feeling and stuff. And we had talked about it. And he walked away. And my moment of insight in that second was, gosh, you know what? I'm a really good friend. I have every quality it takes to be a good friend. I have a lot of empathy and I'm trustworthy and all this. I sure am not a good friend to myself.
Right.
And that was my moment. That was the moment of realizing I would never say to anyone out loud what I say to myself in my head. And from that moment on, I made a commitment to myself that I was going to then use that as my rule. If I wouldn't say it out loud to someone, I'm not going to say it anymore. And that took some doing because, again, it was a pattern, a habit, right? So changing it took some while. But I would catch it, and I'd give myself credit for catching it. And as soon as I would catch it, I'd say, okay, well then, all right, we're not going to keep doing this then. And I would stop. So yeah, a moment of insight can be about something that really isn't working for you. It should be about something that really isn't working for you. And then you can do something about it. It's rather empowering to see it that way.
What causes that moment of insight? How do you get to that? And is there a way? I mean, obviously this is a thing you did for yourself. So how do you make that happen for yourself?
So practically speaking, as much as I'm a believer now, and I'll get to this point in a second, but I'm a believer now that you can have a moment of insight every day. It's just about being aware. It's about being aware, for example, in this conversation right now, really, if I'm present here, something you might say might really cause me to have a bit of a shift, or it might just kind of reaffirm something I've been thinking. But either way, it's a moment of insight. So I now believe it can happen all the time. But as a psychiatrist, what I can tell you is that for many, many, many people, their moment of insight didn't come until they were at a really low point in their lives. And I hate that it takes adversity sometimes to make us stop and consider or to see something differently. But I think when we're at low points in our lives, we've got nothing to lose and you're wide open. And when you're wide open like that, you finally are able to see something. So I don't think everyone has to hit a rock bottom, but it sure seems like times of adversity or challenge might be your opportunity to say, why is it this way? What have I done to contribute it being this way? And what can I do to get out of it? So in that example that I gave you about, speaking to myself in that abusive, critical way, once I realized that I was even doing it, my next step, honestly, was, I wonder how much I do this. Because I didn't realize it in that moment. I was already doing it, and I wonder how much I do this. So another technique that I talk about in the book that was my next step from that point on, was I would tell myself, all right, I'm going to catch myself as much as I can talking down to myself. And every time I do, I'm not going to even go on and on and on about it, but I'm going to note it. So if I were to say to you, in the words of a great author, one fish, two fish, red fish, most people kind of know the rest of that is blue fish, right? If you grew up on Dr. Seuss, you kind of know that by heart. And without even really thinking about it, you can go ahead and finish the line of a story like that. So I took that idea and I thought, okay, well, every time I catch myself being critical, I'm just going to say bluefish. And that's my way of saying, hey, you're doing it again. You may want to stop or whatever, but you are doing it again. And in just doing that, I know that sounds silly, but in just doing that, by the end of the day, before I went to bed, I'd lay there and think, man, I probably said bluefish like 6 times today. And it was my way of just kind of making myself even more aware that that's how much I do it. And it's not right. I wouldn't do that to someone else even once in a day. And I just said bluefish 6 times today. And so from that point,
people were like, people were like, he's so hungry. He's just walking around talking about bluefish all the
time. Yeah, well, whatever they took away from it, in my head, it was like, there you go again. But yeah, it was a way of at least being aware of it. And it was my way of keeping inventory without, I didn't want to be aware of it and then get critical of the fact that I was doing it again, right? Because that was the whole point. I'm trying to avoid or trying to stop my pattern of criticism. So bluefish was enough of a easy, almost a fun way of saying, hey, you're doing it again. And when you have a habit you're trying to break, the first step is to be made aware that you're doing it. If you're trying to, if you bite your nails and you're trying to break that habit, most of the time you don't even know that you're biting your nails. So if I were to ask you, hey, Sean, if during the interview, if you see me, if we're on video, if you see me and I start biting my nails, would you just point that out to me? Well, when you point it out to me, first of all, I could get real defensive about it.
Of course.
And say, I was in the middle of saying something really important and you cut me off, or I could realize that you were trying to help me. I could be aware of the fact that I'm doing it, and then I've got to immediately do something else. I can sit on my hand, and that's my way of not doing it. Well, it's no different when you're trying to change the habit of thinking. You first have to be made aware when you're doing it, and then you have to immediately make another choice. And so after hearing bluefish, bluefish, bluefish all day long, I could finally say, well, then every time you say it, just stop. Stop mid-sentence or whatever. Just don't do it to yourself. And over time, then I was able to break the habit of, look, if you're going to be your own worst critic, you should also be your own best supporter. And I became better at balancing my thinking.
But you're saying you just gave yourself a code word and that you, at the end of the day, would say, I said this so many times. Now, I can't give myself the same code word, so I think I would probably use something like the 5,000 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. But, that's neither here nor there.
Well, I was going to say, whatever works for you is great. Yeah. As long as you know what you're talking about, then that's what matters. Right. And if it's something that's funny, the good thing about that is, again, most of the time when we're trying to change habits or when we're trying to have some transformation occur in our lives, it's usually about something pretty heavy or negative or emotional. And so a little bit of humor even gives you a chance to take the edge off the moment. So I'm going to be less likely to be bothered by you pointing out that I was biting my nails if our decided code word was going to be monkeys, bananas. Then at least when you say that, I'm less likely to chew you out and more likely to chuckle a bit and say, all right, yeah, I hear you, and then sit on my hand.
Right. And especially if I go monkeys, bananas, and then you go bluefish, then there's a lot going on in that moment.
All kinds of stuff there.
Yeah.
So much floating around in the room now. Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, the strategies to have change happen in your life is, number one, to be made aware or make yourself aware of what's not working, right? Try to catch yourself when you're doing something that's not working, and then trying to find another way to do it. So, for that, the example I gave you, right, is a particular type of example, but it really applies to anything. I mean, one of the things that I see as a psychiatrist is that when people come to see me, they've solidified assumptions about themselves. They've been telling themselves the same story in their lives for so long that it sort of becomes their truth. And you've been living a life based on that truth, but it was never really truthful. It's just what you've been telling yourself over and over and over again. So another example I'll give you is, as a child who was an anxious kid and was someone who was bullied a lot, I started to believe, truly that I wasn't good enough. And so every instant of my day that I thought was further proof that I'm not good enough kind of solidified my own story in my head. So if I didn't get a good grade on a test, there was more proof that I wasn't good enough. If my parents got upset with me for something I had done, there was further proof that I wasn't good enough. And so over time, I talk about a really low point in my life at 20, when I was in college. It had gotten to the point where I had told myself that so much that I'd really started to believe that even when people tell me I'm good enough, even when I had awards from schools, or I had, I had applied to med school and gotten in, and all these things that should have told me I was good enough, but somehow in my head I just couldn't accept it and couldn't believe it. So it is about challenging the stories that we've been telling ourselves. And we all have a story we've been telling ourselves. And we've been telling ourselves that story since childhood. And then certain things happen in our childhoods would seem to be further proof of it until we finally believe it. And so many, many, many people have actually been living adult lives based on a story they started way back there as a kid, and then let it keep going. Mm-hmm. So I think it does take, still, no matter what the example is, I think it takes the awareness of what's not working, really trying to catch it, and then really trying to substitute something else for it.
Wow. I got to say, you're singing my song, Suvrat, about all these things. Do you think that this, the difficulties that people have with themselves in terms of either of the things you've talked about or the other stuff you've seen in your practice, are all these things a recent phenomenon?
I don't think it's recent. I do believe that we've all struggled with oftentimes the same doubts and struggles for a very, very long time. I think what's exciting for me, and I think what's reassuring for me, is people are willing to talk about it more in different platforms. So this right here, right now, this discussion, it wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago, right? And here we are, you and I having a really great discussion, hopefully being witnessed by lots of people, and they're taking away from it whatever it is that they're taking away from it, having their own moments of insight. So if you and I can sit here and be real about what we've gone through and our own doubts, well, then it allows someone else to be a little bit more likely to do it as well. So I do think people have a greater willingness to do it. Which is great. I can tell you, when I first went into psychiatry 20 years ago, I live and work right near each other, and I live in a suburb of Atlanta. And if I saw people 20 years ago at my grocery store, I think people would take their carts and go the other way because they didn't want anyone to know that they knew me. And now it's one of these things where I'm in the cereal aisle, and I see people all the time, and I'm so grateful for it. And they come up and say, "Hey," and they introduce me to whoever they're with, and I introduce whoever I'm with, and then they'll say, "This is my psychiatrist."
So this is your shrink, huh, Bob?
Right. That's it. That's it. This is the shrink I was telling you about. Mm-hmm. So again, I think that's awesome. That's so reassuring that we're willing to talk about it. So all that being said, we still have a long ways to go. There's still a stigma. There's still a lot of shame that has to be tackled in terms of people being willing to be vulnerable. But I am encouraged. I think we're headed in the right direction that way.
And you feel like, or I think this is what you said, you feel like many, many people, if not most people, struggle with a lot of the same things. Yes. So that really was one of the reasons why I felt so compelled to even write a book. Is one of the advantages that I have and the privileges that I have is I sit all day long and session after session get to talk to people about again, what are their deepest fears or doubts or challenges. And what struck me from the very moment I became a psychiatrist was we were ultimately all talking about the same things. We really were, whether it was
about not being good enough, or whatever these themes are. It was coming up session after session after session, and even though, like I said, everyone has a individual story, no doubt about it, the feelings that were associated with their stories were also the same over and over and over again. And then, as it turns out, the way to help people get through that also was the same. So some of what we just touched on, right? Challenging your story and wondering where it came from, and trying to catch it, and then trying to create a second story for yourself. It was all the same thing. And so I thought to myself, well, if this is what's so valuable, clearly it's valuable because it keeps coming up. And if these are the same struggles we're all dealing with, then why aren't we talking about this stuff? So the book was really my attempt to take wisdom from thousands of patients, not just my wisdom, but wisdom of thousands of patients, and say, well, here's what we've learned. What have you learned? And maybe this will help you too. Wisdom to me is the knowledge that comes from living life. So all of us have wisdom. You have wisdom. I have wisdom. And more than ever, we need to share wisdom. And more than ever, even though we have all these platforms, it's not always used to share wisdom. We don't have dinner at the table together as much anymore, where wisdom would have been passed down. So we have to find other ways to spread wisdom. And this was my way of trying to do that.
Which is great, but I want to go one step further with that.
Yeah.
So there are certain things that we hold to be true. And I'm not talking about we hold these truths to be self-evident. I'm talking about, like, if you drop an object from the top of a tower, science says that it will accelerate towards the Earth at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared, right? That's the gravity that's gonna move it towards the Earth. That was not something that was always known, but now we know that it's going to accelerate at that rate towards the ground. We also know in mathematics the transitive property, right? If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. These are just things. They're like the laws of math and science. And if we're all struggling with the same things, and yet I sit here and I go, I'm the only one who's having these problems until I talk to somebody like you about it, why is the stuff that you're talking about in your book not part of, for example, the educational system? Why are people not? Is that a ridiculous idea that people should be taught the tools to deal with this stuff, and taught that it's not that they're not alone in these struggles early on?
I mean, not only is that not a ridiculous idea, if you were in the room with me right now, I would have high-fived you. That makes me so excited. Yeah, we need to be teaching kids how to understand themselves as emotional beings. We do a lot of discussion and teaching in school about health, right? You have health class, and you talk about nutrition and that pyramid, and all kinds of good.
Put a condom on a banana.
Right. You have all these really great discussions about physical well-being, and if I walked into a room and said to people, "Hey, how you guys doing?" and how you feeling physically, people would not have a problem with being able to understand what I was talking about. If you were sick, you would say, "No, I'm feeling better," or if you were doing well, you'd say, "Yeah, no, I've been walking more lately," and we'd have some kind of discussion. But when I use the phrase emotional well-being, I feel like a lot of people don't even know what I'm talking about, and why is that? Why are we not able to say it's just as important to know how to process and understand and identify and release your emotions as it is to take care of your physical wellness? It's no different. And we have to teach kids how to do that. And I feel like the crisis, and I don't use that word lightly, but I feel like the crisis that we're experiencing right now, when you see, rates of suicide, the CDC just talked about how the rates of suicide in 10 to 14-year-olds has gone up 50-something%. Well, how is that? Why is that happening? Mm-hmm. And you hear about all the impact of social media on the lives of children and how they feel about themselves. Why is that? We need to really be aware of the fact that children are growing up in a time where they are constantly bombarded by messages, for example, of not being good enough or the need to be perfect, and we're not giving them the tools to be able to sort through their feelings about it so that they can come out of this in a healthy sort of way. That's how much of a crisis I believe this is. And so one of the universal truths that I believe is we all have emotions. And yet we don't always know how to deal with them. I don't think we do. And again, men perhaps in particular, get messages from an early point in your life. You don't cry, stop being a baby, boys don't do that, or, whatever. And we don't learn it. Well, at some point you're going to have to. You're going to have to learn how to process and deal with emotion. So I think whether you're male, female, adult, or child, it's truthful to say we could all stand to know how to be more emotionally well.
Right. Like if they had a class, in high school, you had to take social studies, English, a language, either classical or just a contemporary language, or both. I had to take both. I took Greek and Spanish, and I'm not trying to brag, but I took both of those things.
I took Latin and Spanish.
Right.
So, there you go.
So, and then you had to take a class in emotional intelligence. It seems like that would be, a positive thing. Yeah.
Yeah, worthwhile. I think so too. It's a shame that it's not there, but it's going to happen because, again, I hate to say it, but it takes sometimes times of adversity before people say, what now? How's this going to change? And again, that's the moment of insight. And as a society, I think we're reaching, again, having this moment of insight of realizing that there is a real crisis here in helping people deal with struggle. Just to use one example of that, school shootings is the biggest slap right now in terms of we are not doing right by our children. We're not. So we have to teach them this.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you bring that up because we are, as we discussed earlier, we're about the same age. Now, I don't know where you grew up, but did you have to do nuclear bomb drills when you were a kid?
I grew up here in the South, so I don't remember nuclear bomb drills.
Okay, so when I was a kid...
I do remember tornado drills, like where we'd have to kind of put your hand over your head and sit in the hallway.
Well, that was basically the same drill. I mean, that's what we had to do, for, as if that was going to help us with nuclear bombs. But now you hear these stories about kids who have to go in their room and be silent for hours at a time. I mean, it's just it's distressing. I don't know.
It's distressing and it's tangibly affecting our children because I can't tell you how many children I see who have anxiety and what's considered to be a reassurance to children that we're going to do this drill. For a lot of my anxious kids, that's the worst day.
Of course.
Especially when they know it's coming up. It brings every what if and every doubt and every second guessing moment to the forefront in their heads and they become incredibly panicky. So yeah, it's terrifying. The idea of it is just terrifying.
So let's get those classes out there in school so everybody can figure out that they're not alone. Sam I am, green eggs and ham. We have a Spotify playlist for the show.
Yeah. Okay.
The Sean Conroy Gets Happier playlist. Do you have a song that you would recommend that you personally feel belongs on a Gets Happier playlist?
For sure. And I'm taking us back to, again, you and I are contemporaries and peers in terms of our age.
Love it.
Do you remember St. Elmo's Fire?
Of course.
All right. So you got to put Man in Motion. You got to put that song in there because if there is a song about hope, and my book is all about purpose and hope. Even when I loved that song, I didn't understand that song. And now as an adult, when I listen to that song, not only does it take me back to 80s fashion, but it also takes me back to recognizing I actually held on to that song more than I realized. Mm-hmm. It really is about hope and the possibility of things. So Man in Motion for sure needs to go in there.
Awesome. That is perfect. Suvrat, thank you so much for being here or being there while I was here. And I hope people do find you on social media. This was great.
Thank you for having me here or there. I appreciate that too. And I'd love to do it again sometime.
We're not leaving. We're never leaving. The executive producer of Sean Conroy Gets Happier is Lauren Dunitz. The field producer is Pete Galamaga. Our sound engineer is Aaron Brungart. The show was edited by Lauren Dunitz. The show was recorded at All Things Comedy Studios in Burbank, California. Please rate and review the show on iTunes, especially if you have something positive to say. Tell people about the show. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Sean Conroy. Check out our Spotify playlist, Sean Conroy Gets Happier. We take song selections from every guest, so it's starting to become a little eclectic. Please subscribe to our RSS feed. See you next time on Sean Conroy Gets Happier.